In a remote Afghan outpost, a decorated combat medic was about to conduct routine training. What started as a standard defensive tactics demonstration took a shocking turn when she came face to face with predatory power disguised as military authority. Staff Sergeant Letty Rodriguez wasn't your typical soldier. For 4 tours of duty, she had spent her life saving lives under fire, known for her lightning-fast reflexes and unwavering moral compass. The silver star on her chest told only part of her story. The martial arts training from her boxer grandfather told the rest. When she encountered Major Robert Garrison's additional instruction, she had no idea she was walking into a trap 20 years in the making. Rodriguez's split-second defensive response would shatter more than just Garrison's shoulder. It would crack open decades of institutional silence. What began as a training exercise would become a reckoning. The entire military justice system would never be the same after one woman refused to be another silent victim, choosing instead to fight back in front of 150 witnesses who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen the truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on Forward Operating Base Sentinel as Staff Sergeant Letty Rodriguez stepped into the center of the makeshift training area. 150 soldiers from multiple units formed a wide circle around her, their desert fatigues a sea of tan and brown against the hard-packed earth. The Joint Operations exercise had brought together personnel from across the region, and Letty had been chosen to demonstrate defensive tactics, a recognition of her reputation as both a decorated combat medic and skilled martial arts instructor. "All right, listen up." Letty's voice carried across the assembled troops, cutting through the low murmur of conversation. At 28, she commanded respect through presence rather than volume. 4 tours of duty had carved lines of experience around her dark eyes, but her movements retained the fluid grace her grandfather had taught her in the cramped gym of East LA, where she'd learned that survival sometimes meant knowing how to fight back. "Roll your shoulders." She felt the familiar weight of her gear, the silver star ribbon on her chest catching the light. Today we're covering basic defensive maneuvers. The goal isn't to win a fight, it's to create distance, disorient your attacker, and get to safety. In combat zones, these skills can save your life when your weapon jams or you're caught off guard. Private First Class Sarah Kim stood near the back of the crowd, her slight frame almost hidden among the taller soldiers. She watched with intense focus as Letty began demonstrating escape techniques, each movement precise and economical. For Sarah, these sessions represented more than tactical training. They were a lifeline, a way to reclaim some sense of control in a world where she often felt powerless. "The key is using your opponent's momentum against them," Letty continued, her voice steady and instructional. "Size and strength advantages disappear when you know where to strike and how to move." She demonstrated a wrist break, then a knee strike, explaining the mechanics with the same methodical approach she used when teaching combat medicine. Specialist Rosa Martinez smiled with pride from her position in the front row. As one of Letty's medical trainees and regular attendees at her self-defense classes, Rosa had seen how these skills transformed soldiers, especially the women who too often found themselves vulnerable in an environment that was supposed to protect them. Captain James Jazz Williams observed from the edge of the circle, his analytical mind cataloging Letty's techniques. As an intelligence officer, he appreciated her systematic approach to breaking down complex movements into teachable components. He'd served under her when she was a squad leader on his first deployment, and her competence under fire had earned his deep respect. What he felt for her now went beyond professional admiration, though military regulations kept those feelings carefully buried. "I need a volunteer for the next demonstration," Letty announced, scanning the crowd. Several hands went up, but before she could select someone, a commanding voice interrupted. "I'll assist with this exercise, Staff Sergeant." Major Robert Garrison strode into the circle with the confident bearing of a 20-year veteran. At 45, he cut an impressive figure, tall, square-jawed, with silver threading through his dark hair and enough ribbons on his chest to command immediate respect. The assembled soldiers automatically came to attention. "At ease," Garrison said, his smile warm and practiced. "I happened to be passing by and thought this would be an excellent opportunity for some realistic scenario training." He turned to Letty, his eyes lingering a moment too long. "With your permission, of course, Staff Sergeant." Something cold crawled up Letty's spine, but military protocol demanded compliance. "Of course, sir." She forced her expression to remain neutral, though every instinct her grandfather had honed in her screamed danger. Garrison moved closer, ostensibly positioning himself for the demonstration. "Now, soldiers, in a real confrontation, your attacker won't follow the script. They'll use surprise, confusion, and their perceived authority to their advantage." His voice carried clearly across the training area, but his movements brought him uncomfortably close to Letty. Captain Williams felt his jaw tighten. Something was wrong with this scenario, though he couldn't immediately identify what. Garrison's behavior seemed appropriate for a senior officer providing additional instruction, but Williams had learned to trust his instincts about people's motivations. "The key element attackers rely on is their victim's hesitation," Garrison continued, his hand suddenly gripping Letty's wrist, too tight, too intimate for a training exercise. "They expect submission to authority, especially in military contexts." Letty's breath caught. This wasn't training. The grip, the positioning, the predatory look that flashed across Garrison's features when he thought the assembled soldiers couldn't see, she recognized it all. How many women had experienced this same moment, this same sickening realization, with no witnesses and no recourse? "Sometimes," Garrison said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, meant for her ears alone, "the best training happens one-on-one, later, in private." The words, combined with his other hand moving toward her body, triggered something primal in Letty. Every self-defense class she'd taught, every woman she'd seen broken by those who were supposed to protect them, every lesson her grandfather had drilled into her about never being a victim, it all crystallized in a single moment of perfect clarity. Her response was instantaneous and devastating. Letty pivoted, using Garrison's grip against him, her free hand striking his extended arm at precisely the right angle. The leverage was perfect, his position completely compromised by his own predatory overconfidence. The sharp crack of dislocating bone echoed across the suddenly silent training area as Garrison's shoulders separated with a sound like breaking kindling. Garrison's scream of pain and shock shattered the afternoon calm. He dropped to his knees, clutching his ruined shoulder, his face contorted in agony and disbelief. The practiced mask of military bearing collapsed entirely, replaced by something ugly and desperate. "You fucking bitch," he gasped, his voice high and thin with pain. "You have no idea what you've just done." The words hung in the air like a confession. 150 soldiers stood frozen in stunned silence. Some stared at Garrison writhing on the ground, others looked at Letty, who stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, her face pale but composed. The training exercise had become something else entirely, a moment of truth that would define everything that followed. Captain Williams stepped forward instinctively, his training warring with his understanding of what he'd just witnessed. The official version would be that a training exercise had gone wrong. The truth was written in Garrison's excessive aggression, his whispered words, and Letty's perfectly executed defense against an attack that had nothing to do with military instruction. Sergeant First Class Miguel Santos had seen enough combat to recognize the difference between an accident and a necessary response. His weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes met Letty's for a brief moment, a silent communication between soldiers who understood that some battles were fought in unexpected places. The sound of boots on hardpack announced the arrival of the military police, summoned by someone in the crowd. They approached the scene with professional efficiency, their expressions neutral as they assessed the situation. A senior officer injured, a staff sergeant standing over him, and 150 witnesses to something that would require very careful handling. "Ma'am, sir, we need you both to come with us," the senior MP announced, his voice cutting through the tension. As the plastic restraints clicked around her wrists, Letty felt a strange calm settle over her. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, triggered a chain of events that would either expose decades of hidden corruption or destroy her career and possibly her freedom. But looking at the faces of the soldiers watching, especially the women like Sarah Kim and Rosa Martinez, she knew she'd made the only choice she could live with. Major Garrison, supported by medics and still clutching his shoulder, shot her a look of pure hatred as they loaded him onto a stretcher. "This isn't over," he hissed through gritted teeth. Letty met his gaze steadily. "No, sir, I don't think it is." As she was led away from the training area, the 150 witnesses remained standing in their circle, the weight of what they'd seen settling over them like desert dust. Each would have to decide what version of events to report, what truth to tell, and whether they had the courage to stand behind what their eyes had shown them. The afternoon sun that had witnessed the incident now cast long shadows through the barred windows of the military police station as Staff Sergeant Letty Rodriguez sat rigidly upright on the metal bench of her holding cell. The adrenaline from the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a hollow ache in her chest and the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. Every few minutes, the sound of boots echoed through the corridor. Investigators, officers, personnel whose hurried conversations she could only partially hear through the thick walls. "Rodriguez," the MP guard called, his keys jangling against his belt. "Time for processing." The medical examination came first, conducted by a female Navy corpsman with kind eyes and gentle hands, who documented every bruise, every mark that might serve as evidence. Letty found herself grateful for the woman's professionalism as she answered questions about her physical condition, her mental state, any injuries she might have sustained during the altercation. "For the record," the corpsman said quietly as she completed her notes, "there's no evidence of injury to your hands or arms consistent with an unprovoked attack. The defensive wounds on your wrists, however." She paused, meeting Letty's eyes. "Those tell a different story." 3 miles across the base, Captain James Williams sat in his quarters staring at the blank incident report form on his laptop screen. As an intelligence officer, he'd written hundreds of reports, each one requiring precise language that conveyed facts without interpretation. But this report felt different, loaded with implications that extended far beyond the immediate incident. His phone buzzed with a text from his West Point roommate, now stationed in Germany. "Heard there was drama at your FOB. Hope you're staying out of it." If only it were that simple. Williams had seen Garrison's behavior, heard the whispered words that weren't meant for the assembled soldiers, witnessed Letty's split-second decision to defend herself against what was clearly not a training exercise. The official version emerging from the command structure bore no resemblance to the truth he'd observed. He began typing. At approximately 14:30 hours, during a defensive tactics demonstration, then stopped, his cursor blinking accusingly at the incomplete sentence. Every word he wrote would either support a lie or potentially end his career. Sergeant First Class Miguel Santos faced a similar dilemma in the NCO quarters, where Senior Enlisted Advisor Command Sergeant Major Richardson sat across from him, radiating the kind of authority that came from 30 years of military service. "Miguel, you've been around long enough to know how these things work," Richardson said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional wisdom. "Training accidents happen. Officers and enlisted personnel sometimes have miscommunications during high-stress exercises. Nobody benefits from turning this into something bigger than it needs to be." Santos nodded slowly, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. At 33, he'd seen enough genuine training accidents to know the difference between unfortunate miscommunication and predatory behavior. But he'd also seen enough good soldiers destroyed by speaking uncomfortable truths. What about the Rodriguez family back in LA? Single mother, siblings depending on her military income? A court-martial for assaulting a superior officer would ruin all of that. Sometimes the kindest thing is to keep the scope of an incident manageable. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Webb worked methodically through his contacts, making calls that would shape the narrative before it could spin beyond control. His first call went to Garrison's longtime aide, Staff Sergeant Bradley Pierce. "The Major's going to be fine," Webb assured Pierce, his voice confident and reassuring. "But we need to make sure everyone understands what happened out there. This was a training exercise that got out of hand because Rodriguez misunderstood the Major's instructions. She overreacted, and now she's trying to cover her mistake by making wild allegations." Pierce, who had observed enough of Garrison's private behavior to harbor his own suspicions, nonetheless found himself nodding along. Career preservation was a powerful motivator, and Webb painted a picture where loyalty to Garrison protected everyone's future. The initial witness interviews revealed the challenge facing military investigators. Private Johnson described seeing some kind of training demonstration that went wrong. Corporal Anderson reported confusion about who was supposed to do what, then suddenly the Major was hurt. Specialist Davis admitted to being distracted by equipment checks and not really seeing how it started. But other accounts painted a different picture. Private First Class Sarah Kim, despite her natural inclination towards silence, found herself unable to deny what she'd witnessed. "It didn't look like training," she told the investigator quietly. "The Major was too close," and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looked scared before she defended herself. Specialist Rosa Martinez provided the most detailed account, describing Garrison's approach, his positioning, the way his hands moved beyond any training scenario would require. "I've been to Rodriguez's self-defense classes for months. That was a real defensive response, not a training exercise gone wrong." As evening fell over Forward Operating Base Sentinel, the immediate crisis had been contained within military channels, but the deeper implications continued to spread like cracks in a foundation. Phone calls were made to higher command, lawyers were consulted, and political considerations began to factor into decisions that should have been purely about justice. In her holding cell, Letty lay on the narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of a military base settling into evening routine. She thought about her siblings back in East LA, about the soldiers she'd trained and treated, about the choice she'd made in that split second when everything changed. Tomorrow would bring formal charges, legal proceedings, and the beginning of a battle that would test everything she believed about honor, duty, and the courage required to stand up for what was right. The system had already begun its work of self-preservation. The question now was whether truth would survive the process. The fluorescent lights in the military police interview room buzzed with the persistence of desert flies, as Staff Sergeant Letty Rodriguez sat across from Major Amanda Cross, the Army lawyer assigned to her defense. At dawn, the formal machinery of military justice had lurched into motion with the efficiency of a system designed to process cases quickly and quietly. "The charges are serious, Rodriguez," Major Cross said, sliding a manila folder across the metal table. Her voice carried the weariness of someone who'd defended too many soldiers caught in the grinding gears of military bureaucracy. Article 128. Assault consummated by a battery upon a commissioned officer. Article 86. Absence. Leave during the restraint period. They're also considering Article 134. Conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Letty opened the folder, scanning the formal language that reduced yesterday's moment of self-defense to cold legal terminology. Article 128 carries a maximum of 3 years confinement and dismissal from service, she read aloud. The prosecution will argue that regardless of what preceded the incident, you used excessive force against a superior officer in front of 150 witnesses. Cross leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. But I've read the preliminary medical reports. The defensive wounds on your wrists, the positioning described by several witnesses. There's another story here, isn't there? Before Letty could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them. Through the interview room's reinforced glass, she could see 2 men in crisp Class A uniforms, Criminal Investigation Division agents whose presence indicated this case had already escalated beyond routine disciplinary action. Special Agent David Park entered first, his notebook already open, followed by Agent Jennifer Walsh, whose penetrating gaze immediately assessed every detail of the room's occupants. Park's voice was professionally neutral as he introduced himself and began the formal interview process. We're here to establish the facts surrounding yesterday's incident during the defensive tactics demonstration, Park stated. This investigation will be thorough and impartial. Agent Walsh activated her digital recorder. For the record, please state your version of events leading up to Major Garrison's injury. Letty glanced at Major Cross, who nodded encouragingly. Major Garrison volunteered to assist with my demonstration. He positioned himself inappropriately, made verbal statements that indicated non-training intent, and initiated physical contact that constituted assault. I responded with necessary defensive force to protect myself. What specifically did Major Garrison say? Walsh pressed. He suggested that the best training happens one-on-one, later, in private. Combined with his physical positioning and inappropriate contact, his intent was clear. Park made careful notes, but his expression remained skeptical. The formal investigation would require corroborating evidence, witness testimony, and a clear pattern of behavior that supported Letty's version of events. 2 buildings away, Private First Class Sarah Kim sat in the mess hall, mechanically eating her breakfast while fragments of overheard conversation swirled around her. The incident had become the primary topic of discussion throughout the base, with opinions forming along predictable lines. I heard Rodriguez has been gunning for promotion and saw this as her chance. Training accident becomes assault charge. Suddenly she's the victim instead of the perpetrator, Corporal Matthews said to his table mates. But Chen offered a different perspective. Man, I was there. Garrison was way too close, way too hands-on. That wasn't training, that was something else entirely. Sarah's spoon clattered against her tray as the familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She had heard similar conversations before, whenever rumors circulated about inappropriate behavior by officers. The pattern was always the same: doubt, victim blaming, institutional protection of those with rank and influence. "You okay, Kim?" Specialist Rosa Martinez asked, sliding into the seat across from her. Rosa's concerned expression suggested she understood exactly what she was experiencing. "I keep thinking about what we saw yesterday," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the mess hall noise. "That wasn't an accident." Rosa leaned closer. "I've been thinking about it too, and about other things I've heard over the past few months. Stories that didn't seem connected until now." Meanwhile, Captain James Williams had transformed his quarters into an unofficial investigation center. His laptop screen displayed personnel files, deployment records, and transfer requests, information that painted a troubling picture of Major Garrison's 20-year career. Williams had learned long ago that intelligence work required looking beyond official documentation to find patterns that others missed. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Garrison's previous assignments showed an unusual pattern of early transfers, often coinciding with informal complaints that had been handled through administrative channels rather than formal military justice procedures. 3 different bases, 5 separate incidents that had been resolved quietly. typically with the complainants accepting transfers or early discharge rather than pursuing formal charges. Williams cross-referenced these incidents with personnel records of the soldiers involved. The pattern was consistent. Young enlisted personnel, typically female, who had suddenly requested transfers or experienced mysterious disciplinary problems that derailed their careers. The documentation was careful, bureaucratic, and almost certainly coordinated to prevent anyone from seeing the larger picture. His secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Colonel Hayes. "Need to see you. ASAP. Bring your preliminary assessment." At the base medical facility, Dr. Elizabeth Reeves completed her examination of Major Garrison's shoulder injury. The orthopedic damage was significant but consistent with a precise defensive maneuver executed by someone with extensive martial arts training. More interesting to Dr. Reeves were the defensive wounds she had documented on Rodriguez during the previous evening's examination. The pattern of bruising on Rodriguez's wrists suggested forceful restraint, while the positioning and severity of Garrison's injury indicated a defensive response rather than an aggressive attack. As a Navy medical officer with 15 years of experience treating both combat injuries and victims of assault, Dr. Reeves recognized the difference between training accidents and genuine defensive encounters. She completed her medical report with careful attention to objective findings while avoiding interpretive language that might influence the investigation. But privately, she found herself hoping that someone in the chain of command would possess the courage to ask the right questions. As the afternoon investigation sessions continued, Specialist Rosa Martinez quietly organized informal meetings among female soldiers stationed at FOB Sentinel. Word spread through carefully constructed networks, women who had learned to support each other in an environment that often failed to protect them. "We need to document everything we know," Rosa explained to the small group gathered in an unused supply room. "Not rumors or gossip, but specific incidents, dates, witnesses. If there's a pattern here, it needs to be exposed." Private Kim found her voice among these women, describing months of uncomfortable encounters with Major Garrison that she had dismissed as typical military behavior. Others shared similar experiences, creating a mosaic of predatory conduct that had been hidden in plain sight. The formal investigation continued with methodical precision, but underneath the official process, a different kind of truth-seeking was taking shape. Soldiers were beginning to connect isolated incidents into a broader pattern, questioning assumptions they had never challenged before and finding courage in collective action. By evening, the foundation of institutional protection that had shielded Major Garrison for 2 decades was beginning to show cracks. The question was whether those cracks would widen enough to let the light of truth penetrate, or whether the system's protective mechanisms would prove strong enough to contain the damage and preserve the status quo. The third day after the incident dawned gray and oppressive, desert winds carrying the scent of approaching sandstorms across Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Private First Class Sarah Kim stood outside the Criminal Investigation Division office, her hands trembling as she clutched a manila envelope containing 3 months of documented harassment that she had finally found the courage to report. Inside the envelope were photographs of inappropriate text messages, witness statements from her bunkmate about late-night training sessions Major Garrison had requested, and a detailed timeline of escalating behavior that had made her dread every interaction with her commanding officer. The evidence represented months of silent suffering that she had convinced herself was normal military life until she had witnessed Letty Rodriguez's moment of resistance. "I can do this," Sarah whispered to herself, repeating the mantra that Rosa Martinez had taught her during their clandestine support group meetings. "My voice matters." Special Agent Walsh looked up from her desk as Sarah entered, immediately recognizing the telltale signs of a soldier carrying the weight of untold trauma. The young woman's posture was rigid with fear, but her presence in the CID office represented a crucial breakthrough in what was becoming a far more complex investigation than initially anticipated. "Private Kim," Walsh said gently, gesturing toward the chair across from her desk. "Thank you for coming forward. I know this isn't easy." Sarah's voice was barely audible as she began recounting months of predatory behavior that Major Garrison had disguised as mentorship and professional development. Each incident alone might have been dismissed as misunderstanding or overly aggressive leadership, but together they formed a pattern of systematic harassment designed to isolate and intimidate a vulnerable young soldier. He would call me to his office late at night, always when other personnel weren't around. He'd stand close to me, touching my arm. Too close, make comments about my appearance, ask personal questions about my relationships. When I tried to maintain professional distance, he'd remind me that my career advancement depended on his recommendations. Agent Walsh documented every detail while maintaining the careful neutrality required for official investigations. But privately, she recognized the familiar markers of institutional predatory behavior. The pattern Sarah described was textbook: gradual boundary violations designed to normalize inappropriate conduct while maintaining plausible deniability. 2 hours later, Captain James Williams received an encrypted message requesting a discreet meeting in the base communications center. When he arrived, he found Corporal Jennifer Hayes and Specialist Amanda Foster waiting in a secured briefing room, their expressions tense with the weight of decisions that could alter their military careers permanently. "Sir," Corporal Hayes began, her voice steady despite the obvious stress, "we heard about Kim coming forward. We have our own experiences to report." Williams listened with growing horror as 2 additional soldiers described their own encounters with Major Garrison. Hayes recounted a deployment 6 months earlier when Garrison had cornered her in a supply depot and made explicit sexual propositions disguised as career advancement opportunities. Foster described similar behavior during field exercises, including physical intimidation when she'd attempted to report the incidents through normal channels. "Why didn't you report these incidents at the time?" Williams asked, though he suspected the answer. Foster's laugh was bitter. "Report to who, sir? Lieutenant Webb always scheduled private meetings with anyone who had concerns about Major Garrison's leadership style. Those meetings usually ended with suggestions that maybe the complainant had misunderstood the situation, or that making formal accusations might damage unit cohesion and their own career prospects." The intelligence officer in Williams recognized the systematic nature of the cover-up operation. Webb hadn't just been enabling Garrison's behavior, he'd been actively managing it, creating a protective barrier that intercepted potential complaints before they could reach higher authority. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Marcus Webb was conducting his own damage control campaign with the ruthless efficiency of someone whose career depended on containing the expanding investigation. His afternoon schedule included informal conversations with key witnesses whose testimony could prove problematic for Major Garrison's defense. "Specialist Chen," Webb said, settling into the chair across from the young communications specialist in a private office he had requisitioned for these sessions. "I understand you were present during the unfortunate training accident involving Major Garrison and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez." Chen shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the careful phrasing designed to establish Webb's preferred narrative. "Yes, sir." "Training exercises can be confusing, especially when they involve realistic scenarios," Webb continued, his tone conversational but underlined with implicit threat. "Sometimes soldiers think they see things that didn't actually happen. The stress of combat deployments can affect perception and memory." The implication was clear. Chen's version of events needed to align with the official narrative, or his own military future might face unexpected complications. Webb had perfected this technique over years of protecting Garrison, using subtle intimidation disguised as helpful guidance to suppress inconvenient testimony. But Webb's protective machinery faced an unexpected challenge when he attempted similar tactics with Sergeant First Class McGill Santos. The veteran NCO listened politely to Webb's suggestions about misunderstood training scenarios and the importance of unit cohesion, then responded with the directness of someone who'd survived 15 years of military service without compromising his integrity. "Lieutenant," Santos said quietly, his weathered face impassive, I've seen enough real training accidents to know the difference between equipment malfunction and predatory behavior. What I witnessed wasn't an accident, and my testimony will reflect that fact. Webb's carefully constructed composure cracked slightly. Certain, I hope you understand the potential consequences of testimony that undermines unit morale and command authority. Career advancement opportunities can be significantly affected by perception of reliability and judgment. Santos stood up slowly, his weathered face impassive. Sir, I've kept soldiers alive for 15 years. I won't compromise that record to protect someone who preys on the people I'm sworn to defend. As evening approached, Letty Rodriguez discovered that her isolation in the holding facility hadn't protected her from retaliation. Anonymous messages had been slipped under her cell door throughout the day. Typewritten notes warning her to accept the plea deal, stop making trouble, and think about your family back home. The final message was more explicit. Your siblings depend on your military income. Accidents happen to families of troublemakers. Letty stared at the threatening note, feeling the cold fear that came from realizing how far the protective network around Major Garrison was willing to go. But alongside the fear came something else, a burning anger at the system that would threaten innocent family members to protect a predator. She tore the threatening messages into small pieces and flushed them down the cell's metal toilet. If they wanted to escalate this battle beyond military channels, she would meet them with the same fierce determination that had earned her a Silver Star for valor under fire. Outside her window, the desert wind continued building toward the sandstorm that meteorologists predicted would hit the base within 24 hours. The approaching storm seemed appropriate, a natural force that would obscure visibility and test everyone's ability to navigate by instruments rather than sight. The question was whether truth or institutional self-protection would prove more durable when the storm finally passed. The sandstorm that had been threatening forward operating base Sentinel finally arrived at dawn, turning the sky into a wall of brown dust that reduced visibility to mere feet. But inside the Criminal Investigation Division office, a different kind of storm was building, as Special Agent Walsh processed the 5th formal complaint filed against Major Robert Garrison in less than 24 hours. Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez sat across from Walsh's desk, her hands steady as she provided detailed testimony about incidents that had occurred during her previous deployment under Garrison's command. Unlike the younger soldiers who had come forward earlier, Vasquez possessed the confidence of an 8-year veteran who had finally found institutional support for speaking her truth. He used the same pattern with all of us, Vasquez explained, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. Isolation, intimidation disguised as mentorship, and explicit threats about career consequences if we reported his behavior. The difference now is that we're not isolated anymore. Agent Walsh nodded, adding Vasquez's statement to the growing collection of evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic predatory behavior spanning multiple deployments and bases. The pattern was undeniable, documented with the kind of corroborating detail that would be difficult for any defense attorney to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. 3 buildings away, Captain James Williams hunched over his computer in the Intelligence Center, his security clearance providing access to personnel databases that most investigators couldn't penetrate. What he'd discovered during his unauthorized research would have been career-ending under normal circumstances, but these circumstances were far from normal. The evidence was damning. A complex network of transfers, early retirements, and administrative discharges that had been carefully orchestrated to remove potential witnesses and accusers from Garrison's sphere of influence. Williams had identified 12 soldiers across 4 different bases whose military careers had been systematically destroyed after they'd attempted to report Garrison's behavior through official channels. "Jesus," Williams muttered, printing the documentation despite regulations about classified information handling. The pattern revealed institutional complicity that extended far beyond Lieutenant Webb's local damage control efforts. Someone with significant command authority had been protecting Garrison for years, possibly decades. His secure phone buzzed with an urgent message from Colonel Patricia Hayes. "My office. Now. Bring everything." Hayes paced behind her desk like a caged animal when Williams arrived. Her usually perfect uniform wrinkled from a sleepless night spent fielding phone calls from Pentagon officials who were suddenly very interested in a routine training incident at a remote Afghan outpost. "The story leaked," Hayes announced without preamble. "Some reporter from the Washington Herald got wind of the investigation and started making calls to family members back home. By this afternoon, this becomes a national news story." Williams felt his stomach drop. Media attention would transform their carefully controlled military investigation into a public relations nightmare that would demand immediate resolution, likely through whatever means would minimize institutional embarrassment. "There's more," Hayes continued. "I received direct orders from General Morrison's office. Quote, minimize public exposure and resolve this matter through appropriate administrative channels." Unquote. The implication was clear. Pressure was mounting to contain the scandal through plea bargains, transfers, and other mechanisms that would avoid the publicity of a formal court-martial. Williams recognized the familiar pattern of institutional self-protection that he documented in his unauthorized research. "Colonel," Williams said carefully, "I need to show you something." He spread the printed documentation across Hayes's conference table, watching her expression change from frustration to horror as she absorbed the scope of what he'd uncovered. The evidence revealed a protection network that implicated multiple commands and suggested coordination at levels far above their current authority. "How long have you known about this?" Hayes asked quietly. "I suspected something was wrong, but I only confirmed the pattern yesterday," Williams replied. "The question now is whether we report this up the chain of command or find another way to ensure it reaches people who will act on it." Meanwhile, Lieutenant Marcus Webb was discovering that his damage control operation faced unexpected resistance from soldiers who were no longer willing to be intimidated into silence. His afternoon meeting with Corporal Torres had ended with the young soldier formally requesting to speak with CID investigators rather than accepting Webb's suggestions about misremembered events. Webb's carefully constructed network of intimidation was unraveling as soldiers found courage in collective action. The informal support group organized by Rosa Martinez had evolved into something approaching a coordinated resistance movement, with participants sharing information, comparing experiences, and providing mutual protection against retaliation. Desperate to regain control of the narrative, Webb placed a series of phone calls to contacts in higher command positions, painting the emerging investigation as a conspiracy by disgruntled soldiers seeking attention and career advancement through false accusations. "Sir, we're dealing with a coordinated attack on military discipline and command authority," Webb explained to Brigadier General Paul Davidson during a secure video conference. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has somehow convinced several junior enlisted personnel to make wild accusations in support of her assault on Major Garrison. But General Davidson had already received briefings that contradicted Webb's narrative, including preliminary reports from CIB investigators who had found the accuser's testimony credible and well-documented. The general's response was carefully neutral, but indicated that Webb's influence was rapidly diminishing. At the base medical facility, Sergeant First Class Miguel Santos underwent the psychological evaluation that military regulations required before he could provide testimony in a formal hearing. The evaluation was supposed to assess his mental fitness and reliability as a witness, but Santos recognized it as another mechanism for discrediting inconvenient testimony. "Sergeant," the military psychologist said, reviewing Santos's personnel file, "your deployment history shows significant combat exposure. Post-traumatic stress can sometimes affect perception and memory formation. Are you certain your recollection of recent events hasn't been influenced by previous traumatic experiences?" Santos studied the psychologist's face, recognizing the subtle pressure to provide an excuse for recanting his testimony. "Doctor, I've seen enough combat to know the difference between enemy fire and friendly predators. My memory of what Major Garrison did to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is crystal clear, and my testimony will reflect that clarity." As evening approached, the sandstorm began to subside, but the institutional storm was intensifying. Letty Rodriguez, still confined to the holding facility, received an unexpected visitor. Major Cross, her defense attorney, carrying news that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her case. "Rodriguez, things are moving faster than anyone anticipated," Cross announced, settling into the metal chair across from Letty's bunk. "The media attention has forced higher command to accelerate their timeline. But there's something else, something that changes everything." Cross opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Captain Williams provided evidence of a systematic cover-up operation spanning multiple bases and commands. This isn't about one incident anymore. It's about institutional corruption that goes to the highest levels of military leadership. Letty absorbed this information with the tactical awareness of a combat veteran who understood that battlefield conditions could change rapidly and dramatically. The case was no longer simply about seeking justice for one incident of assault. It had become a test of whether the military justice system could confront its own institutional failures. "What does this mean for the charges against me?" Letty asked.
"It means we have leverage now," Cross replied, "but it also means the stakes are much higher. People with significant power and influence are invested in making this problem disappear. We need to be prepared for escalation that goes far beyond normal military justice procedures." Outside the holding facility, the desert wind carried the last traces of the sandstorm toward the horizon, leaving behind crystal-clear visibility and air that tasted of possibilities, both hopeful and dangerous. The crystal-clear morning that followed the sandstorm brought with it a revelation that would test everyone's resolve. Staff Sergeant Letty Rodriguez was awakened at 0500 hours by the sound of boots in the corridor outside her cell, followed by the metallic clang of keys and the formal voice of the military police sergeant announcing additional charges. "Rodriguez, you're being charged with Article 92, failure to obey order or regulation, Article 134, adultery, and Article 86, absence without leave during unauthorized meetings with commissioned officers." The MP read from his clipboard, his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious absurdity of filing adultery charges against someone who had been confined for the past week. Major Cross arrived within an hour, her face grim as she reviewed the new charges that had been filed without her knowledge or presence during what should have been routine legal proceedings. The timing was suspicious, the charges seemingly fabricated, but the military justice system allowed for such tactical maneuvering when institutional interests were threatened. "This is pure retaliation," Cross said, slamming the folder onto the metal table. "They're trying to bury you under paperwork and procedural complications. The adultery charge is particularly creative, apparently based on evidence of inappropriate contact with Captain Williams during your confinement." Letty stared at the fabricated evidence, photographs that had been carefully cropped and timestamps that had been manipulated to suggest forbidden contact between her and Williams. The sophistication of the frame-up indicated resources and coordination far beyond Lieutenant Webb's local damage control efforts. "They're getting desperate," Letty observed, her tactical mind analyzing the situation with the same clarity she'd brought to battlefield medical emergencies. This level of retaliation means they're afraid of what the investigation might uncover. 3 buildings away, Captain James Williams discovered that his unauthorized research had triggered an internal security investigation when CID agents appeared at his quarters at dawn with a warrant to search his personal computing equipment. The charges were vague but serious: misuse of classified information systems, unauthorized access to personnel databases, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Agent Park, who had been investigating Garrison's case, now found himself in the awkward position of investigating Williams for the very research that had exposed the institutional cover-up. The irony wasn't lost on either man as they sat across from each other in the same interview room where witnesses had been providing testimony about systematic abuse. "Captain, you accessed personnel files from multiple bases without authorization," Park stated, his voice reflecting the discomfort of investigating someone whose research had been crucial to understanding the scope of the corruption. Williams met Park's gaze steadily. "Captain Park, those files contained evidence of a coordinated effort to silence sexual assault victims across multiple commands. If accessing that information to protect soldiers is a crime, then the system is more broken than I thought." The interview was interrupted by a secure phone call that Park took in private, emerging 20 minutes later with new instructions that would fundamentally alter Williams's situation. "Captain, you're being transferred to Fort Bragg effective immediately. Transportation has been arranged for this afternoon." The message was clear. Williams was being removed from the theater of operations before he could provide further assistance to the investigation or to Letty's defense. The transfer was perfectly legal, bureaucratically justified, and tactically devastating to the case against Garrison. Specialist Rosa Martinez was experiencing her own form of institutional retaliation. Her morning began with a surprise inspection of her quarters that resulted in charges for possession of unauthorized personal items, specifically printed materials related to victims' rights and military justice procedures that she'd been distributing to female soldiers. The military police who conducted the search were thorough and professional, documenting violations that would normally result in minor disciplinary action. But in Martinez's case, the charges were being elevated to potential court-martial offenses, with suggestions that her subversive activities threatened unit cohesion and military discipline. Specialist Martinez, Lieutenant Webb explained during her initial questioning, promoting dissent and encouraging soldiers to make false accusations against their commanding officers is a serious matter. The Army depends on trust and respect for authority. Your activities undermine that foundation. Martinez recognized the familiar pattern of intimidation disguised as legitimate concern. But she also understood that her situation was different from the original incident. She wasn't a victim seeking justice. She was an advocate who had helped others find their voices, and that made her particularly dangerous to the protective system. The escalation of retaliation extended beyond the base to Letty's family in East LA, where her younger sister Carmen received anonymous phone calls suggesting that continued support for Letty's false accusations might affect the family's safety and financial security. The calls were untraceable, carefully worded to avoid explicit threats, but their message was unmistakable. "Letty's always been a troublemaker," one caller explained in a reasonable conversational tone. "Sometimes family members suffer when soldiers don't know their place. It would be unfortunate if anything happened to disrupt your mother's medical care or your brother's college scholarship." Carmen recognized the veiled threats for what they were, but felt powerless to respond effectively. The family had always depended on Letty's military income and benefits, making them vulnerable to exactly this kind of pressure. The systematic nature of the intimidation suggested resources and coordination that extended far beyond normal military disciplinary procedures. Back at FOB Sentinel, Private First Class Sarah Kim discovered that speaking truth had consequences she hadn't anticipated when she received orders for immediate transfer to a remote outpost in eastern Afghanistan, a location known for its isolation and limited communication capabilities. The transfer was presented as routine personnel rotation, but its timing eliminated her as a potential witness during any formal hearing proceedings. "I'm not going," Sarah announced to Rosa Martinez during one of their clandestine support group meetings. "They can court-martial me, but I won't let them silence me by shipping me off to the middle of nowhere." Her declaration sparked similar defiance among other potential witnesses, creating a situation that military leadership hadn't anticipated. Instead of accepting transfers and intimidation quietly, the soldiers were organizing collective resistance that threatened to transform individual testimony into coordinated defiance of institutional authority. Agent Walsh found herself in an impossible position as the CID investigation she'd been conducting was suddenly constrained by new parameters handed down from higher command. Her superiors explained that the investigation needed to focus on the specific incident involving Rodriguez and Garrison, rather than exploring broader patterns that might implicate other personnel or commands. Agent Walsh, Colonel Hayes explained during a tense meeting in the base commander's office, national security interests require that we maintain operational security regarding personnel transfers and command decisions. The investigation should focus on provable facts related to the training incident rather than speculative connections to other matters. Walsh recognized the bureaucratic language that was being used to limit her investigative authority, but she also understood that pushing beyond those limits would likely end her own career. The system was demonstrating its ability to protect itself through mechanisms that appeared legitimate while effectively silencing inconvenient inquiries. As evening approached, Letty Rodriguez sat in her cell reading the additional charges and evidence that had been fabricated to discredit her testimony and destroy her credibility. The sophistication of the frame-up was impressive, the legal maneuvering professionally executed, and the coordination across multiple commands, evidence of institutional resources being deployed to protect Major Garrison and the system that had enabled his behavior. But alongside her growing understanding of the forces arrayed against her, she felt something else, a cold determination that reminded her of the moment when she'd pulled wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle under enemy fire. Some battles had to be fought regardless of the odds, not because victory was certain, but because the alternative, surrender to corruption and injustice, was unacceptable. The system had shown its true nature. Now she would show hers. The ultimatum arrived at dawn with the systematic precision of institutional machinery designed to crush individual resistance. Major Amanda Cross entered Letty's cell with the exhausted expression of a defense attorney who had spent the night negotiating with prosecutors determined to end this case quickly and quietly.
"They're offering a deal," Cross announced without preamble, setting a thick manila folder on the small metal table. "Guilty plea to Article 128. Assault on a commissioned officer, reduction in rank to corporal, 60 days confinement, and administrative discharge under other than honorable conditions. You keep your benefits, no federal felony conviction, and this whole thing disappears from public attention." Letty stared at the formal plea agreement, recognizing the legal language that would transform her from a decorated combat medic into a discharged soldier with a permanent mark on her record. And Major Garrison? No charges. Administrative counseling for inadequate supervision during training exercises. He'll probably take early retirement with full pension and honors. Cross's voice carried the bitter taste of compromised justice. "Letty, I have to strongly advise you to take this deal. The fabricated charges they've filed against you carry serious jail time if they stick. This offer might be the best outcome we can achieve." Before Letty could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced an unexpected visitor. Colonel Patricia Hayes appeared at the cell door, her usually perfect uniform showing signs of a sleepless night spent fielding calls from Pentagon officials who wanted this problem resolved immediately.
Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Hayes said formally, then waited as the guard unlocked the cell door. I need to speak with you privately. They walked to a secured conference room where Hayes activated electronic countermeasures designed to prevent surveillance, a precaution that immediately signaled the sensitive nature of their conversation. The pressure from above is enormous. General Morrison called me directly last night. The Secretary of Defense's office is involved. They want this case closed before it becomes a congressional hearing that exposes systematic problems across multiple commands. Letty absorbed this information with the tactical awareness of someone who understood that battlefield conditions could change rapidly. How high does this go, Colonel? Higher than either of us imagined. Morrison showed me files documenting similar incidents at 7 different bases over the past 5 years, all resolved through administrative channels, all victims transferred or discharged before they could provide testimony. Garrison wasn't acting alone. He was part of a network that someone with significant power has been protecting. The revelation hit Letty like physical impact. The scope of corruption extended far beyond one predatory officer to encompass institutional complicity at levels that could destroy careers and reputations across the entire military hierarchy. Which means they'll do anything to prevent this from becoming public, Letty said quietly. Hayes nodded grimly. The threat to your family wasn't idle. The resources being deployed against you include surveillance, financial pressure, and worse. Taking this plea deal isn't just about your career, it's about protecting everyone who has supported you. Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent knock. Agent Walsh entered with news that would fundamentally alter Letty's decision-making process. Ma'am, Private Kim refused her transfer orders. She's formally requested to remain available as a witness, regardless of consequences. 5 other potential witnesses have made the same request. The courage of the women who had found their voices through Letty's example created a moral weight that transcended personal considerations. Sarah Kim, Rosa Martinez, and others were willing to sacrifice their own careers to ensure that truth survived this institutional assault. Later that afternoon, Letty received an unexpected visit from Captain James Williams, who had somehow delayed his transfer long enough for one final conversation. His presence in the holding facility violated multiple regulations, but the guards looked away, a small act of rebellion that suggested institutional loyalty was beginning to fracture. I'm prepared to provide testimony about everything I've uncovered, Williams announced, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had chosen principle over career advancement. James, you understand what this means. Your West Point career, your family's expectations, your entire future in the military?
I understand that some things matter more than careers, Williams replied. If we don't stop this here, how many more Sarah Kims will suffer in silence? How many more predators will be protected by institutional corruption? That evening brought the most difficult conversation of all, when Letty's family arrived for what might be their final visit before her court-martial proceedings began. Her mother, Elena Rodriguez, carried the weight of a woman who had sacrificed everything to support her children's dreams, while her younger siblings bore the conflicted expressions of people caught between loyalty and fear. "Mijija," Elena said in Spanish, her voice heavy with worry. "The lawyers say you could go to prison for years. Your brother's scholarship, your sister's medical bills, we've always depended on your military benefits." Carmen, her younger sister, spoke with the passionate intensity of someone who had inherited the Rodriguez family's stubborn streak. "Mom, she's fighting for something important. We can't ask her to surrender just because it's convenient for us." But her brother Miguel, barely 18 and headed for college on ROTC scholarship, represented the practical concerns that military families understood too well. "Letty, they're threatening my scholarship, Mom's medical care, everything. Is this fight worth destroying our entire family?"
The question hung between them like smoke from distant fires, carrying the weight of generations of immigrant sacrifice and the dreams built on Letty's military success. Her family's financial security, her siblings' futures, her mother's health care, all of it depended on benefits that would disappear if she continued fighting. After her family left, Letty sat alone in her cell as night fell across Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The plea agreement lay open on her small table, requiring only her signature to end the nightmare and protect everyone she loved. The rational choice was clear, the practical benefits obvious, the personal cost of continued resistance potentially devastating. But as midnight approached, she found herself thinking about Sergeant First Class Miguel Santos, who had knocked on her cell door despite regulations and spoken quietly about honor, duty, and the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. "Rodriguez," Santos had said, his weathered face reflecting 15 years of military service, "I've seen good soldiers destroyed by corrupt systems, and I've seen corrupt systems protected by good soldiers who stayed silent. The choice you make here doesn't just affect you, it defines who we are as an institution." At 0300 hours, Staff Sergeant Letty Rodriguez made her decision. She tore the plea agreement in half and threw the pieces in her cell's metal waste bin, then sat down to write a letter to Major Cross requesting immediate preparation for full court-martial proceedings. Some battles had to be fought regardless of the cost, not because victory was certain, but because surrender would destroy something more valuable than career, family security, or personal safety. It would destroy the possibility that justice could exist within a system worth serving. The war for the soul of military justice was about to begin in earnest. The sound of Letty's torn plea agreement hitting the metal waste bin seemed to echo across Forward Operating Base Sentinel, setting in motion events that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of military justice. Within hours of her decision to reject the deal and demand a full court-martial, unexpected allies began emerging from the shadows of institutional fear. The first breakthrough came at dawn when a manila envelope appeared on Agent Walsh's desk, delivered by unknown hands during the night shift change. Inside, she found photocopies of official documents that made her hands tremble as she read. Transfer orders with forged signatures, medical reports that had been altered to hide evidence of assault, and most damning of all, email correspondence between Lieutenant Webb and officers at other bases coordinating the systematic suppression of sexual assault investigations. "This is a smoking gun," Walsh whispered to Special Agent Park as they reviewed the whistleblower's evidence. The documentation revealed a network of corruption that extended across multiple commands, with Webb serving as a central coordinator for protecting predatory officers through administrative manipulation and witness intimidation. Mike Meehan. Meanwhile, Colonel Patricia Hayes faced the defining moment of her military career as she prepared for testimony that would either destroy her future prospects or establish her as a leader willing to sacrifice personal advancement for institutional integrity.
Phone call from General Morrison had been explicit. Her testimony should focus on administrative failures rather than systematic corruption. Instead, Hayes sat in her office preparing to violate direct orders from a superior officer by telling the complete truth about what she'd discovered. The evidence Williams had provided, combined with her own investigation into Garrison's protected status, painted a picture of institutional complicity that demanded exposure regardless of personal consequences. "Ma'am," her aide announced, "the formal hearing convenes in 30 minutes. Hayes straightened her uniform and gathered the classified documents that would transform her from career officer to whistleblower. It's time to choose which oath matters more, loyalty to superiors or duty to the Constitution. The formal hearing took place in the base's largest conference room, hastily converted into a courtroom with the efficiency that military logistics could provide when institutional survival was at stake. But as testimony began, the careful choreography of military justice encountered the disruptive force of coordinated truth-telling. Sarah Kim took the stand first, her voice steady as she recounted months of harassment that the system had ignored.
Her testimony was followed by Rosa Martinez, then Corporal Hayes, then Specialist Foster, a parade of victims whose collective courage transformed individual trauma into undeniable pattern evidence. Lieutenant Webb's carefully constructed defense crumbled under cross-examination when confronted with the whistleblower documents. His desperation became apparent as he attempted to discredit the evidence, claiming fabrication and conspiracy, while his own emails were read aloud in the hearing room. Lieutenant Webb, Major Cross asked during cross-examination, "Can you explain this email, where you instruct Staff Sergeant Pierce to discourage Kim from pursuing her concerns through official channels?" Webb's face went pale, as his voice stammered through attempted explanations that only deepened his culpability. The systematic nature of his obstruction efforts became undeniable as email after email was presented, revealing coordination with other bases and explicit instructions for silencing potential witnesses. The moment that broke the institutional dam came when Colonel Hayes took the stand and, under oath, testified about the complete scope of what she'd discovered. Her testimony was methodical, devastating, and professionally delivered with the precision of someone who understood that careers would be destroyed, but justice demanded nothing less than complete transparency. The evidence indicates systematic protection of sexual predators across multiple commands, Hayes testified, her voice carrying across the packed hearing room. This case represents not an isolated incident, but exposure of institutional corruption that has operated with impunity for years. As Hayes spoke, Major Garrison sat at the defense table watching his political supporters begin the careful process of distancing themselves from his increasingly indefensible position. Phone calls were being made in Washington offices, press releases were being drafted, and careers were being recalculated based on the evolving political mathematics of scandal management. The video evidence was presented last, played on screens that allowed every person in the hearing room to witness exactly what had occurred during that training demonstration. The footage was unambiguous, undeniable, and devastating to any narrative suggesting training accident rather than predatory assault. When the video concluded, the hearing room remained silent for long moments as the weight of truth settled over proceedings that had begun with institutional cover-up but had evolved into something approaching actual justice. Agent Walsh looked across the room at Letty Rodriguez, recognizing in her expression the quiet vindication of someone who had chosen to fight impossible odds rather than accept comfortable lies. The truth had emerged not through institutional mechanisms designed to protect it, but despite systems designed to suppress it. The formal hearing would continue for 2 more days, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The question now was whether the exposed corruption would trigger the systematic reforms necessary to prevent future victims, or whether institutional self-preservation would find new ways to protect predators while appearing to embrace accountability. The gavel fell with the finality of institutional reckoning, as Colonel Hayes announced the court-martial verdict that would reverberate through military commands worldwide. Major Robert Garrison stood at attention as 20 years of predatory behavior culminated in formal military justice, guilty on all charges of sexual assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and abuse of authority. The defendant is sentenced to 15 years confinement, reduction to the grade of private, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and dismissal from service.
Pronounced, her voice carrying the weight of institutional transformation. The sentencing represented more than punishment for individual crimes. It marked a fundamental shift in how the military would handle systematic abuse of power. Lieutenant Marcus Webb's court-martial followed within the week, his desperate attempts to plea bargain rejected in favor of full prosecution for obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to suppress criminal investigations. The evidence against him was overwhelming, his coordination with other bases documented in meticulous detail through emails and phone records that revealed the scope of his protective network. 15 years confinement, dismissal from service, and forfeiture of all benefits, the military judge announced as Webb stood trembling at the defendant's table. His career of enabling predatory behavior had ended with the complete destruction of his military future, serving as a warning to others who might consider protecting criminals within the ranks. Staff Sergeant Letty Rodriguez stood at attention in the same conference room where her ordeal had begun,
but now the assembled personnel were there to witness restoration rather than prosecution. Colonel Hayes approached with the formal documents that would expunge all charges from Letty's record and restore her to full-duty status with commendations for exceptional courage in the face of institutional pressure. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Hayes announced, the United States Army formally apologizes for the systematic failures that forced you to defend yourself against criminal assault and then subjected you to retaliation for seeking justice. Your courage in confronting corruption has prevented countless future victims and initiated reforms that will protect service members for generations to come. The Silver Star on Letty's chest was joined by the Army Commendation Medal for Valor, recognizing not just her physical courage during the assault, but her moral courage in fighting institutional corruption despite overwhelming pressure to remain silent. The ceremony was broadcast live to military installations worldwide, serving as both vindication and warning. Agent Jennifer Walsh received promotion to Senior Special Agent and appointment as head of the newly established Military Justice Integrity Division, a specialized unit created to investigate systematic abuse and corruption within military commands. Her first assignment involved reviewing cases from 12 different bases where similar patterns of predatory behavior and institutional cover-ups had been identified. The Rodriguez case exposed fractures in military justice that had been hidden for decades. We now have dedicated resources and protocols for identifying and dismantling protective networks that enable predatory behavior, Walsh explained to the Congressional Subcommittee investigating military sexual assault. Captain James Williams accepted reassignment to the Pentagon's Office of Military Justice Reform, where his analytical skills would be applied to developing new protocols for handling sexual assault investigations. His sacrifice of career advancement for moral principle had been rewarded with opportunities to create systemic change that would protect future service members. The comprehensive investigation that followed identified 47 cases across multiple commands where similar cover-up operations had protected predatory officers while silencing victims. Congressional hearings were scheduled, new legislation was drafted, and military leadership found themselves accountable to civilian oversight in ways that fundamentally altered institutional culture. Private First Class Sarah Kim received promotion to specialist and assignment as a victim advocate, using her experience to help other soldiers navigate military justice proceedings. Her courage in breaking the silence had inspired a generation of service members to speak truth regardless of institutional pressure. Specialist Rosa Martinez continued her medical training under Letty's mentorship while organizing support networks for female soldiers across the military. The informal groups that had provided courage during the darkest moments of institutional retaliation evolved into officially sanctioned victim advocacy programs. Colonel Patricia Hayes faced no formal punishment for her whistleblowing testimony, but her career advancement prospects within traditional command structures had effectively ended. Instead, she accepted appointment to lead the Military Justice Reform Commission, where her willingness to sacrifice personal advancement for institutional integrity became the foundation for comprehensive policy changes. The ripple effects extended beyond individual cases to fundamental alterations in military culture. New training protocols emphasized bystander intervention and reporting responsibilities. Command climate surveys became mandatory and anonymous. Victim protection procedures were strengthened, and retaliation was elevated to a court-martial offense. 6 months after the verdict, Letty Rodriguez returned to medical duties with expanded responsibilities for training female soldiers in self-defense and assault prevention. The combat medic who had saved lives under enemy fire now saved careers and futures,
teaching soldiers that speaking truth was not just permissible, but essential to military honor. The institutional machinery that had once protected predators had been dismantled and rebuilt with accountability as its foundation. Justice had been achieved not through the system working as designed, but through individual courage, forcing the system to become what it claimed to be.
6 months later, the same desert training ground that had witnessed the incident now hosted a ceremony that would have been impossible under the old system. Staff Sergeant Letty Rodriguez stood before a group of newly arrived soldiers, men and women from diverse backgrounds who represented the future of a military institution committed to protecting all its members. "Today's training isn't just about defensive tactics," Letty announced to the assembled group, her voice carrying across the hard-packed desert with the same authority it had possessed during that fateful demonstration. "It's about understanding that real military strength comes from protecting each other, speaking truth, and maintaining the courage to do what's right, even when institutional pressure suggests otherwise." Among the new arrivals, Letty recognized the familiar expressions of soldiers carrying hidden burdens, young faces that reflected the same uncertainty and fear she'd seen in Sarah Kim's eyes months earlier. But now the system offered support structures that hadn't existed before, and training that acknowledged realities the old military had preferred to ignore. Specialist Sarah Kim, now wearing the chevrons of her recent promotion, assisted with the demonstration by explaining the new reporting protocols that had emerged from congressional investigations. Her transformation from frightened victim to confident advocate represented hope for countless soldiers who had previously suffered in silence. "The difference now is that reporting doesn't end your career, it protects it," Sarah explained to the group. "We have victim advocates, independent investigation units, and legal protections that make it safe to speak truth about inappropriate behavior by anyone, regardless of rank." The formal memorial service that preceded training honored soldiers whose voices had been silenced by the old system, names read aloud in recognition of victims who hadn't survived long enough to see justice achieved. Colonel Patricia Hayes, now serving as Military Justice Reform Commissioner, delivered remarks that connected individual sacrifice to institutional transformation. "These soldiers died believing their institution had failed them," Hayes said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Our responsibility is to ensure that future soldiers never face that betrayal alone or without recourse to genuine justice." Captain James Williams, visiting from his Pentagon assignment, observed the ceremony with the satisfaction of someone who had chosen principle over career advancement and discovered that sometimes both could be achieved. His work developing new investigative protocols was being implemented across all military branches, creating systematic safeguards against the corruption that had nearly destroyed multiple careers. Rosa Martinez, now a sergeant and head of the base's victim advocacy program, coordinated support services that had been unimaginable under previous command structures. Her office maintained open doors, anonymous reporting systems, and direct communication channels to independent oversight bodies that couldn't be intimidated or controlled by local command influences. The afternoon training session demonstrated techniques that went beyond physical self-defense to include recognition of predatory behavior patterns, de-escalation strategies, and most importantly, collective responsibility for maintaining unit integrity. Soldiers learned that protecting each other was not just moral obligation, but professional duty. "Notice how the attempted assault followed predictable patterns," Letty explained as she demonstrated defensive techniques. "Isolation, authority manipulation, normalization of inappropriate contact. Recognizing these patterns early allows intervention before situations escalate to physical violence." As training concluded, Letty found herself surrounded by young soldiers asking questions that revealed the cultural transformation taking place throughout military ranks. They wanted to understand not just how to defend themselves, but how to create command climates where defense wouldn't be necessary. Private Rebecca Johnson, barely 19 and fresh from basic training, approached with the earnest expression of someone trying to understand complex institutional dynamics. "Sergeant Rodriguez, how do we know the changes will last? What prevents the old system from returning?" Letty smiled, recognizing the question that would define the ongoing work of military justice reform. "The changes last because people like you keep asking that question. Vigilance isn't a one-time effort, it's a continuous commitment to protecting the values we claim to serve. The evening formation that concluded the day's activities included recognition of soldiers who had demonstrated moral courage in various contexts, establishing heroism as something broader than battlefield valor. Speaking truth, protecting colleagues, and maintaining integrity under pressure were celebrated alongside traditional military accomplishments. As twilight settled over Forward Operating Base Sentinel, Letty Rodriguez cleaned her equipment with the methodical precision that had characterized her military service since enlisting in East LA years earlier. But now her duties extended beyond treating combat wounds to healing institutional injuries that had festered in darkness for too long. The young soldiers walking back to their quarters carried with them knowledge that would shape military culture for generations. Understanding that real strength meant protecting the vulnerable, that true honor required confronting corruption regardless of personal cost, and that the most important battles were sometimes fought not against foreign enemies, but against the failures of institutions they had sworn to serve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new soldiers to train, and new opportunities to demonstrate that justice and military effectiveness were not competing values, but complementary strengths that made the force stronger, safer, and more worthy of the nation's trust. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.